Hi friends, we are group number 7 from physics. Our group members include roll number 43 to 47, Mehrusha, Mirshana, Nishin, Sandra, Shahana, Shamila and Shimna. We are presenting the text Voices from Chernobyl, written by Svetlana Alexievich. The book Voices from Chernobyl, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award, is a monument of suffering and courage even now. The book explores the effect of radioactive contamination due to the result of an explosion at the nuclear reactor of Chernobyl at the night of April 26, 1986. The book is relevant in contemporary times as well. The narrator of the text, a solitary human voice, Lyudmila Ignatenko, wife of the firefighter Vasily Ignatenko, describes the horror of the incident. The effect of the explosion was very high that the radioactive waves reached even neighboring countries. Near 80,000 people died on the spot of the explosion and many people died due to the after effects. Cancer engulfed the people of Ukraine during that period. The effect hasn't ended even now. We could see persons suffering the radioactivity and cancer in all over the world. The book compiled first-hand accounts of victims and rescuers involved in the disaster. The personal concrete narration of the trauma revealed the intensity of accident. Therefore, personal accounts of victims become relevant in revealing the different dimensions or aspects of trauma. Let us look for the more details of one of the terrible man-made disaster on the earth, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor explosion.
Svetlana Alexievich was born at Ivano-Frankivsk in Ukraine in 1948 and spent most of her life in the Soviet Union and present-day Belarus. She started out of her career as a journalist and she developed her own distinctive non-fiction genre, which gathers choice of voices to describe specific historical moment. And she specialized in crafting narratives based on witness testimonies. In the process, she wrote oral history of several dramatic events in Soviet history. For example, Second World War, Chernobyl disaster. Chernobyl disaster is a crucially important work of her literature, unforgettable in its emotional power and honesty. Svetlana listened to come through as heart-rending stories. Her books trace the emotional history of the Soviet and post-Soviet individual through carefully constructed collections of interviews. Her famous works are War's Unwomanly Face in 1985, Last Witness in 1985, Zingy Boys in 1990, Voice of Chernobyl in 1997. She won many international awards, including the 2015 Nobel Prize in the Literature for her polyphonic writings, a monument to suffering the courage in our time.
Chernobyl nuclear power plant was the pride of Soviet Union and was one of the greatest nuclear power plants until 1986. The power plant was situated in Pripyat city of North Ukraine. The Pripyat was one of the modern cities of Soviet Union. Chernobyl used RBMK reactors or light water graphite moderated reactors instead of normal reactors. The specialty of these RBMK reactors was that they used graphite instead of water as moderator. The normal reactors used water as the moderator, but here graphite was used as the moderator, which was called as very efficient and very producive. And uranium-235 was the fuel used in this type of reactors. So what led to the collapse of these indestructible reactors? We are about to find out. The explosion took place in the reactor number 4 of Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The occupants of reactor number 4 at that time was Anatoly Dyatlov, who was the deputy chief engineer of the power plant, a chief engineer Tetnov, Anatoly Akimov, and Yuri Tegreb. All these people were conducting an experiment on that day to increase the efficiency of the water pumping generator. So the procedure of the experiment was such that they have to lower the power by lowering the control rods into the reactor core. So they lowered the power to 700 megawatt, but then they realized that the power was decreasing further. The power led to 500 megawatt, then it dangerously was at 30 megawatt, which was very dangerous to the reactor. So they began raising the control rods manually, and they raised the power up to 200 megawatt. They were not able to raise the power further. But as per the orders from Anatoly Dyatlov, they conducted the experiment even at 200 megawatt, and this led to the increase in thermal energy inside the reactor, and the power started to build up. The core exploded, but the authorities were not aware that the core exploded. They assumed that it was some other fire. The power plant used uranium-235 as a fuel, and each uranium-235 emits millions of neutrons per second. And each neutron is like a bullet that pierces through everything that comes in its path, whether it is wood, metal, or flesh. And the rate of the explosion was such a way that it was almost equal to 2 times of Hiroshima per hour. Further days, hundreds of people died due to the exposure, and almost 90% of Ukraine was affected by radioactive neutrons. Still, now, the city of Pripyat is like a ghost town. There are no people living there, and it is said that it would take 300 years to make that place livable. The design flaws in RBMK reactors and the unawareness and unpreparedness of the employees to a potential crisis led to the greatest nuclear disaster ever known to man.
The Voice from Chernobyl is a compilation of interviews with the survivors of the nuclear reactor accident. The book begins and ends with the testimony of 2 widows. One is the young wife of a Pripyat firefighter who went at night to fight the blaze. It begins with the story of young pregnant wife of one of the first firefighters, Vasily Ignatenko, who responded to the fire at the reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and of his slow, untimely death. Vasily Ignatenko and his wife Ludmila Ignatenko are newlyweds. They were walked around holding hands even if they were just going to the store. They were always a loving couple. One day she heard a noise. She looked out the window. Her husband said that close the window and go back to sleep. There is a fire at the reactor and he will be come soon. But she didn't see the explosion. She saw the flames, the old sky, the tall flame and the smoke. The heat was terrible and he didn't come back. At 7 next morning, she was heard. He was in the hospital. She ran over there, but the police encircled it. The policeman shouted, "The ambulances are radioactive, stay away." Finally, she saw him. He was sullen and puffed. She could hardly see his eyes. Many of the doctors and nurses would get sick themselves and would die. At 10 o'clock, cameraman Shishenok died. He was the first. The doctors kept telling them they had been poisoned by gas. No one said anything about the radiation. At the evening, the hospital is surrounded by a huge crowd, and the doctor said that they were being taken to Moscow at that night. Later in the day, she started vomiting. She was 6 months pregnant. After some time, she knew from a police officer that they were admitted hospital number 6 at the Shukinskaya stop. It was a special hospital for radiology. She could not get in.
The government had transported them to a special hospital for further treatment in radiology department. The head radiologist explained Lyudmila Ignatenko about the condition of her husband. His central nerve system was completely affected and skull was also damaged. She was prevented from going near him or touching him. The doctor also advised her not to have kids anymore as she might be exposed to radiation. Lyudmila thinks that she needs to hide that she is pregnant because they won't let her see him. She saw him sitting on the bed playing cards with others. The next day, when she came, they were lying by themselves, each in his own room. The doctor explained that everyone's body reacts differently to the radiation. At the hospital, his condition got worse as days went by and the body began to change. Burns surfaced and the color of the body changed. While narrating, she repeatedly says that it is impossible to explain what she has seen in words. Her narration is deeply personal, with feelings of love towards her husband, anxiety, fear, and despair. She narrates the last 2 weeks she spent with him in the hospital. He doesn't forget his promise of showing her the beautiful Moscow and the fireworks on Valentine's Day. He got so bad day by day that she couldn't leave him even for a second. The orderlies in the hospital refused to nurse them. They demanded protective clothing. It was the soldiers who carried the sanitary vessels, wiped the floors down and changing the bedding. His body degenerated so badly, his skin and hair began to peel off and body produced stools with mucus and blood frequently. He became covered with boils. When he turned his head, there would be a clamp of hair on the pillow. The doctor told her that he had become a radioactive object with a strong density of poisoning. We see her cutting his hair, carrying his sanitary tray. We can see that she takes care of him with lots of love.
1 or 2 days before his death, he asked her to name the baby as Vasya if it's a boy and Natasha if it's a girl. Throughout the narration, she recollects their unforgettable moments in the hospital. And finally, he was dead. She can't leave him. She escorted him all the way to the cemetery. They dressed him up in formal wear with his service cap. They had to cut up the formal wear too because there was not a whole body to put on. They couldn't get shoes as his feet had swelled up. They buried him in barefoot. During the last 2 days in the hospital, his internal organs like lungs and liver were coming out of his mouth. She wrapped her hand in a bandage and put it in his mouth and take out all that stuff. It's so pitiful and as well as heart-touching to read this. Their body was not handed over to the relatives and was buried in Moscow in a special way, in sealed zinc caskets under the cement tiles. The emergency commission tried to console their family by saying that the dead were no longer belong to their family, but they are the heroes of the state. 2 months later, she gave birth to a girl, Natashenka. She had liver cirrhosis. Her liver had 28 antigens and she had congenital heart disease also. Later, she was also died. The body of the child was also buried with special care. The state had relocated the survivors of this tragedy and gave them separate apartments in Kiev. A lot of them still go to the reactor for work. Most of them were affected by bad diseases and many others succumb to death. But they don't leave their jobs. They can't even think of the reactor closing down. So the story ends by saying that nobody would understand what they say and no one want to hear about their worries and death. Here she narrates the story of their love.
Voice from Chernobyl, written by Svetlana Alexievich. The 1986 accident at Chernobyl, the nuclear reactor, is one of the best known industrial accidents of all time. But there has been relatively little reporting of its human consequence. Voice from Chernobyl begins with a brief encyclopedia-style account of the effects on Belarusia, where 2 million people live on contaminated land, but otherwise present on the human side of those. It is an oral history offering first-hand accounts from those involved with or affected by the disaster. The wife of a first response fireman who took several weeks to die from the radiation possessing self-settlers who stayed behind or returned to the contaminated zone. Russian refugees from Tajikistan who preferred the risks of radiation of those young men with guns. The different perspectives of those Alexievich listened to come through she has clearly reworked her material. A certain amount of detachment is perhaps necessary to prevent overpowering succession heart-rending stories. One of the speakers concludes, "You can write the rest of these yourself. I don't want to anymore." The personal details of the stories are what grabs the reader, but they often touch on broader themes. Some of those Alexievich records are historians and philosophers themselves, but the more concrete accounts are often the most revealing. The Chernobyl disaster is linked by many to the Second World War, which still looms large for older generation, and by some of the end of communism and breakup of the Soviet Union, which followed soon afterwards. Voice from Chernobyl is a powerful work which deserves a board of readership, as well as being unique exploration of the human effects of widespread radioactive communication. It offers a view of the final years of the Soviet Union and of life of Belarusia. It should certainly be read by those caught up in recent revival enthusiasm for nuclear power, if only so possible consequences of accident are clear. Thank you.